Saralyn, how are you doing this morning?
Oh, it's great to see you, Ellen. I wish we could be together at the Smithsonian.
Well, I'm hoping this is going to be an interesting panel for folks because we're going to have a really interesting discussion, and obviously we're going to leave time for questions at the end. So as we're talking out there in the audience, please think about questions that you want to ask around this issue of human health, which is so important, as we have found out from this amazing body of research that we've been able to build up over the last 20 years on the International Space Station. And Saralyn, I was hoping that for the folks who might not be familiar with this topic, if you could run through some of the sort of highlights of the effects of microgravity. You know, what happens to the human body when we take it from the Earth into space?
It's a really great question, Ellen. The human body adapts very quickly to microgravity. And in fact, every single system in the body adapts. So if you work through musculoskeletal system, you see that you begin to lose bone, and relatively quickly your muscles begin to atrophy. You also have a distribution of fluid that flows to your head, and we call it Stofan distribution. Some of our astronauts say they feel like they've developed a moon facies, a bit of a puffy face. We also see in the cardiovascular system changes as well, as far as how the heart has to pump fluid. And these all have, different impact on men and women. From the neurovascular system, we see changes. There's a syndrome that's developed that's called SANS, and that's an acronym for Space-Associated Neuroocular Syndrome. And basically, there's increased intracranial pressure in the brain from fluid, and there are visual changes. And interestingly, we see differences between men and women, where men tend to have more severe symptoms and signs compared to female astronauts. Every single system of the body changes, and for people who are studying sex and gender-based healthcare, which I hope we'll talk about, you can discern very small differences which can have profound impact in the body. It's also not just how you adapt in space, it's what the impact is when you come back to Earth, which has gravity, of course, and as we look to the Moon and Mars, where you're dealing with 1/6 and 3/8 gravity, we're going to see differences as well. So, for example, some of our female astronauts, when they come back from space exploration, they may experience what we call orthostatic hypotension, basically where they feel faint when they come back to a gravity-type environment.
And that's a visible difference that you see in the data between the male astronauts and the female astronauts?
We have seen that. And in fact, both men and women may experience orthostatic hypotension or feeling faint because, again, there's fluid shifts. The body has fluid going to the brain, the body senses overload, and you shift your volume. So when you come back, you may feel lightheaded. Interestingly, when men and women experience stress like that, women tend to increase their heart rates, men tend to vasoconstrict, clamp down on their vessels. It's probably due to the hormonal milieu, the differences between men and women, where women, of course, have more estrogen and men have more testosterone.
That's fascinating. And before you mentioned stress in there, so I wanted to get to the point that it's not just physical health we're talking about for understanding the effects on astronauts. It's also mental health plays in.
Yeah, it's a really good point. It's the mind-body connection. So psychological changes are extremely important. So first of all, think about it. It's isolation. You're away from your loved ones. I think as all of us have been going through quarantine and these
Wait a minute, that sounds familiar.
Yes, we sense that. We feel that sense of loss. So it's really important to be able to maintain that continuity and that contact. So there are behavioral changes, and we know men and women have differences on Earth, where women are more likely to be affected by affective disorders such as depression. Unfortunately, only about a quarter are appropriately diagnosed, and of that group, only a quarter appropriately treated. But we see differences between men and women, but we also just see it as a human issue. And again, it doesn't mean that it's a disease or an abnormality. It's just an adaptation to an extreme environment. I think as we head our sights towards Mars, imagine not being able to see your planet for the first time, not being able to see where your home is and where your loved ones are. So there's a lot of effort put forth to try to ensure that mental health issues and behavioral health issues are taken care of and addressed.
Now, as you've been working on a lot of these conditions that you have been talking about, a lot of what we've been doing on the International Space Station over the last 20 years is developing mitigations for one of those. And one of the ones that I thought was actually the most interesting is the effect of diet and nutrition on some of these health conditions that I joke sometimes when I talk to audiences, low salt, healthy diet, balanced diets make a difference in space, just like they do on the ground.
Yeah, nutrition is extremely important. And again, also for behavioral health, think about if you're not eating what you are used to, or it's a very bland diet, think about how your mood is impacted. So we know diet plays a very important role. And there's also that social structure about eating together. I've heard so many wonderful reports from our astronauts that just being able to get together for a meal really just improves mood. I mean, think about our lives now where we're not able to connect with our loved ones and we see how we feel. But yes, nutrition plays a very important role. So for example, let's take into account bone changes. We know that calcium is extremely important to bone health, and we know that we begin to leach calcium from our bones when we go into space. So we're really attuned to what is the calcium in our diet. There's that sodium-calcium balance, which you just talked about. So you want to ensure your bones and muscles have the appropriate amount of calcium. So we look at that. Also vitamin D. Think about our lives. We get a lot of vitamin D just from going out into the sunlight for about 10, 15 minutes a day. So when you're in an environment where you're not exposed to that per se, you have to think about the vitamin D in your diet as well. So nutrition is very important, not only for musculoskeletal health, but also potentially for radiation protection, looking at the use of antioxidants and other what we call nutraceuticals. So a lot of efforts being played into ensuring that we have a good balanced diet, and also taking it into account as the body adapts what those nutritional changes will be. And for example, can you grow plants in space? How well do they grow? How do you take care of them? That will be very important as well.
Now, you mentioned radiation, and obviously this is the humans to Mars, and it's obviously going to the moon first and then on to Mars. But once we get out past the Earth's magnetic field, we are out in a radiation environment that is not beneficial to humans. It's a combination of radiation from the sun, as well as galactic cosmic rays, so really high energy particles. So this radiation dose is something that also NASA has put a lot of effort into studying. There's experiments that go on up at Brookhaven, but that unique sort of dual type of radiation field and having humans out in that radiation field is not something that we've experienced for more than a few days back in the Apollo program.
Yes, and it's a really important point because lifetime radiation exposure is very important not only for our lives on Earth, but certainly for our lives in space. And some of the early studies on radiation were actually done around 1945 from looking at atomic bomb survivors. Now the Department of Energy radiation workers are being studied to, I think, get a better idea of where we are. Interestingly, women may have less permissible exposure limit compared to their male colleagues for various issues, regarding, for example, cancer. So if you look at a Mars mission exposure for a 600 or 900-day mission, the radiation exposure may be between 1 to 1.2 sieverts. And women, both missions, women have a 25% greater risk of death compared to their male colleagues. So what we need to ensure is that we have the appropriate countermeasures, because we are going to have men and women both on these missions. And we have to develop the technologies to be able to protect our astronauts, both when they are on their way to Mars, while they're on the planet, and when they return back.
But the technology question is a good one, and for people who don't realize, you can shield with metal against solar radiation, but galactic cosmic rays go right through it, and in fact sometimes excite particles, and it's really bad to actually have metal shielding. Water, however, does work. So if you can sleep in a cabin that has water walls, you're really cutting that radiation dose down. So if you can spend time in protected ways, so there's ways to use just the physical design to keep the radiation dose down. But I know people have also been looking at technologies, wearables. Can we design wearables for the astronauts that protect a lot of the organs that are more vulnerable to cancer dose?
Yeah, so being able to wear these smart devices, I think, will allow you to do EVAs, to do your extravehicular activities, to be able to do your spacewalks. Certainly when you're on the surface of the moon or Mars, you want to be able to get out and about. So you're wearing your habitat around you and you want to be protected. I think I'm really encouraged. I think as we've looked at 3D modeling and computational modeling and looking at new technologies of how we can protect our bodies by wearing our shield around us, I have a lot of faith that that's going to happen. But you bring up something really important, Ellen, and that's the issue of PPE, personal protective equipment. I know there was a great deal of discussion about PPE fitting the female body. And it's not just for space. We see it even for frontline workers here on this planet. So, for example, 75% of frontline workers are women. Of the folks who've been infected, 73% have been women. And I think part of that is not just a numbers game, it's because the protective equipment does not fit. So a lot of effort's been really put forward by NASA and a lot of other organizations and agencies to ensure that we have PPE that meets the needs of men and women. So you look at movement, you look at anthropometry, body proportion, just sort of shrinking, pinking it, as I often say, it doesn't work. And we have to really be attuned to how the body moves and how the body adapts.
Yeah, it's really interesting. These differences are there, and that was certainly highlighted this past year with the issue around the spacesuits, and we saw that it's not just actually even an issue just of size, that women tend to be smaller than men, but it's also, are the gloves designed for women's hands versus men's hands? So are we adapting equipment to all the people who will use the equipment so that they can be doing their best job? And that's something that I think, especially when you're putting people out into a situation that has a lot of risk associated with it, you want to make sure they have the best tools for the job. And that design issue is, I know, something you've spent a lot of time on.
Yes, and it's extremely important. So you want to ensure that everybody has the resources as well as the opportunities and tools to be able to live and do their jobs well and safely. And we have the capability through artificial intelligence, 3D printing, computational modeling to really advance the field. I think for me, I became extremely attuned to this during the whole Ebola outbreak. And it was really of concern that women who were taking care of their loved ones or they were healthcare workers were getting infected when they were donning and doffing their gowns, taking on and taking off their gowns, because the gowns didn't fit, gloves didn't fit, as you mentioned, so they actually had to duct tape their gloves to their gowns. Even the boots didn't fit. So we see it across every single sector. And from that effort, I developed a nonprofit called iGiant, which is, of course, an acronym. You got to have an acronym here. And that stands for the Impact of Gender and Sex on Innovation Novel Technologies. And it's the only nonprofit accelerator for gendered innovation in the world, working across health, IT, transportation, and retail sectors. And for example, right now we're looking at developing better PPE to meet the needs of men and women. And I know the space program has also put a significant amount of effort to ensure that they have the technology so that people can do their jobs well and safely. And it's not just in space. We see it in the military. The military has actually done a phenomenal job this past year of trying to look at their equipment, bringing back their female aviators, and actually all those who are on the front lines protecting to ensure they have equipment.
Now, as we move out to the moon in this decade, and then hopefully to Mars in the next decade, is there a good science plan for what are the avenues of research we need to pursue for human health in space? Is there a strong sort of decadal plan, if you will? I'm used to the other sciences where there's a really thought out decadal strategy. Do we have that to make sure we're maximizing our time at the moon to keep humans safe as we move further out into the solar system?
Yeah, so NASA has often worked very closely with the National Academy of Sciences, and there have been various decadal reviews and studies that have been conducted. So there's a pretty robust plan into place. And it's not only for just human health, but also looking at sex and gender. And Ellen, I want to be clear, when we talk about sex and gender, we're not talking about who's faster, better, or smarter. It's not a competition. It's just being able, as you mentioned, to develop the tools and resources so everyone can do their jobs well and safely. I had the privilege over the last 18 years to help lead and conduct 2 decadal reviews to assess the impact of sex and gender on how the body adapts in space. And it was actually the Office of the Chief Scientist, as well as HEO and ACHMA and many of the other offices within the agency that really supported this effort. We had our last decadal review was conducted in 2012. Published in 2014. We even had a virtual workshop before we were even doing a lot of virtual workshops in 2014. So it's time. It's time now to bring together our scientists, both within the academic community, within the agency, to assess what have we achieved, how far have we come, and where do we need to go? And we have just a tight timeline to go back to the moon and on to Mars. So we have to begin planning now because everything has a time lag, and we want to ensure we get the best recommendations.
And the fact that we're going into this unique radiation environment out at the moon that we don't have a huge amount of experience with, it's really critical to make sure we maximize our time in that environment to gather the data that we need to make sure that we can keep astronauts safe. And I think for people who have some sort of, well, are there really that many sex and gender differences? I don't think we have to look any further than what we've been seeing with COVID, where men are dying at a higher rate than women are. And so there are these differences, and we need to understand them, because then we can create mitigations that level the playing field back out.
Yes, and that's so true. So, for example, the National Academy of Science defines sex as the biological construct, and gender is more the psychosocial construct. We know it's a little bit more complicated with the role of epigenetics. As we interact with the environment's interacting with us, and it influences our genome, changes it. We have certainly seen that with COVID. Men are dying at twice the rate compared to women. We also are seeing a situation which we call long haulers. In the UK, they call it long haulers. It's more of a chronic COVID, where individuals who have survived COVID then may go on to develop chronic disability. There's some early reports that are showing that women may be more debilitated. So even though they may not have the same mortality rate, they have higher morbidity rates. And again, as we see in space exploration, every single system of the body changes. In COVID, it's a multi-system disease. Every single system. So we are appreciating, these sex differences. And people often ask me, it takes too much time, it takes too much effort, it takes too much expense, why bother? And the answer is it really doesn't. And the gain is so significant because it helps us to understand the etiology, the pathogenesis of disease, and hopefully ways to mitigate and to prevent.
Excellent. We're getting a lot of questions in, so I'm wondering if we should go ahead and pivot to the questions.
Sounds good.
Okay. I'm not sure how we're doing the questions here. I can go back in the chat. And it says from John Chavez, did you say 25% increased risk of death for women?
That's what we have been seeing, is that it's estimated that there would be a 25% increased death rate for women without doing the countermeasures.
Just to clarify, this is back to the radiation issue.
The radiation issue, yeah. So this is, again, without any of our countermeasures and what we're going to do. We're going to level the field. We have to do that, and we will do that.
And my understanding is that that's largely due to the fact that women have a lot of organs that are susceptible to cancers. That is at least some significant part of why that number is raised.
Yeah, so radiation impacts every single system of the body. It can impact the CNS, the brain. We see with folks who have had radiation exposure where there may be cognitive changes, even behavioral health changes, increased rates of depression, impact of memory. We certainly see immunological changes, hematologic changes, and then certainly, of course, coronary artery disease, as well as the development of certain cancers. So for women, lung cancer is certainly an important issue, breast, thyroid, the GI tract.
Okay. From Scott, it says, interesting that you describe these physiological changes as adaptations rather than outright problems. Clearly, they can be problems when returning to full Earth gravity, but could it be these adaptations are entirely appropriate, even non-problematic, when staying indefinitely in Moon or Mars gravity as permanent settlers?
Yeah, it's a really great question. I love that approach because, again, the body's adapting. Just as we're sitting here talking, we're adapting. If we spent time with each other, our hormonal milieu would adapt to each other even. So the answer is potentially yes. It's just that what we see is that we're going to a planet that has gravity. And if we go to the moon, it has gravity. So as we adapt en route, that adaptation may not be effective when you get to a surface that has gravity. And then the other issue is as we colonize, our bodies are going to change. And we have to understand what those changes are so we can develop the best habitats and the tools that we need to adapt to the environment. So for example, there are visual changes when you go out into space, and now the glasses take into account some of those visual changes. NASA launched a challenge competition back in May of 2017. And the person who actually won that challenge competition was an engineer who designed a modular spacesuit to take into account not only sex differences, but as the body adapted into space, so that suit could work for the individual.
That's really interesting. And that question brought to mind something that I had meant to discuss with you earlier, which is this issue that we have obviously a lot of data on human health in 1G. And we have now a good data set, always growing with the International Space Station, on human health in microgravity. But Mars is obviously 1/3 Earth's gravity, the moon even less. And this issue of, is it linear? Are the effects linear? Are they nonlinear? Do they increase? This is a huge area of research. Again, back to that decadal issue of what is the research we need to do in partial gravity environments to really understand where the tipping points are, so to speak, on some of these human health effects.
Yeah, it's a really good point. So looking at partial gravity, these experiments need to be replicated on Earth, and there are different models that have been used to do that. We have ground-based studies. So for example, for the human to model a microgravity, you go into a Trendelenburg position. I often tell people it's like going to the dentist, having your head down, and you do everything that way for days and weeks. And some people actually like that, and others find it just so challenging. So we have models to do that. And I think, again, we'll be developing even better ones as the technology evolves, so we can assess how do you eat and live? How do you metabolize drugs? How do you metabolize nutrition? How does the body adapt will be extremely important. And it's being done. It's being conducted, and I'm sure it will even be more robust as the years go on.
Yeah, I've had the great opportunity to tour facilities both here in Russia, where we do and also in Europe, where we do bed rest studies with humans. They've done these cool water tank study and centrifuge studies, where we use everything we can here on Earth to try to understand those partial gravity environments. But actually having people on the surface of the moon, on the surface of Mars, we're clearly gonna learn an awful lot. We have a question here from Tapaswini Sharma. We are often connected emotionally to food, as different countries and cultures have different food habits. How does the diet affect the astronauts' mental and physical health?
Well, I think as we see how diet impacts us here on Earth, when you have deprivation, you notice it, and it can depress you. There are changes in taste and smell. This was sort of interesting as we've been talking about COVID. Ellen, you mentioned the association with COVID and the changes with how the body adapts. As you have fluid going into your brain, per se, there's a change in your taste and smell. So some folks actually want spicier food, sweeter food, loving chocolate. And we have to have comfort foods. So we also have to take into account those cultural issues. Someone might enjoy herring, for example, in certain Russian foods, and another may not appreciate it. So this will be extremely important. It's one of our basic, Maslow's hierarchy. We need to have our nutrition, and we need to have our shelter, and we need that connection with everyone. So eating is extremely important, and that social connection is extremely important.
Yeah, so many astronauts have told me that's their favorite times, is where, when the astronauts would all connect with each other and actually have that social time. And so again, it's really been interesting to me to understand how food plays into mental health in a really critical way. From Kaiser Aguar, it seems that some vitamins and antioxidants are advantageous within a hormetic zone. Is it understood how the additional stress of micro or low gravity and radiation stress alter that hormesis? That's beyond my educational level. That's going right to you, Saralyn.
Thank you for that question, Ellen. Well, antioxidants and vitamins certainly play a role, but something that is too much may not be good for you. We're also beginning to appreciate that something that goes beyond the physiologic level may not be good for you and may actually cause harm. So we've seen that with some of our vitamins. We've looked at vitamin A and vitamin E just on ground-based health issues. So I think this will be studied. As far as supplements, we'll probably need them. And so we'll need to understand, again, how does the body metabolize? We're going to need to understand sex differences. And we're going to also have to understand, as the body adapts, how those needs will change as well.
And from Emily Apollonio, from a neurological standpoint, what do you feel is the most susceptible component limiting us to reaching Mars?
That's an interesting question. Well, I think one of our issues, as I mentioned earlier, is SANS, the space-associated neuroocular syndrome. It used to be known as visual impairment intracranial pressure, VIP. And so we really have to get our hands around that, because you need to be able to see where you're going, and you need to be able to prevent it. So a great deal of research is being studied in that area. I do find it fascinating that there are sex differences. So I don't know if it's the architecture in the neck where women are able to accommodate those fluid shifts. If it's the hormonal milieu, again, that has that impact, but we definitely have to have an understanding of that.
And how confident are they that that's tied to intracranial pressure? Because I knew at one point there was some research that that seemed to suggest that it wasn't totally intracranial pressure that was actually causing it.
I think it's one part of it. We've looked at a lot of different variables to see what might be associated with it, the levels of oxygen, carbon dioxide. And I think what we have to do is understand the individual variables too. Some people are more affected than others. So again, this is where we take into account, Ellen, the issues of what we call human factors. You and I have talked a lot about that, especially as you were supporting a lot of our sex and gender studies. So human factors, what do we mean? We mean sex and gender, age, race. How does that all play a role in how you develop and how you prevent disease? And this is where it moves us into the realm of precision health, but we have to understand these human factors. We can't negate that.
And do you feel that we're gathering the right data and enough data to really inform these decisions? Obviously, we can only have so many astronauts up at a time, but there's still issues with gathering enough data of astronauts of color, of astronauts from different racial backgrounds, women versus men.
Right.
I know no scientist, no physician is ever going to say they have enough data.
Yeah.
But
Right.
Are you concerned with we need more data? We need more data.
I love data. I think as you have more data, you can data mine, you can find associations, you are better able to care for the population. I mean, we see this even with COVID, as every day as we gather new data. We have ground-based studies. We have certainly our flight-based studies. That's why it's so important to have ISS as a really robust laboratory as well, and working with our partners. And our ground-based studies are extremely important. We need to fly as many people as possible. One of the things I'm really excited about is how we're democratizing space exploration, certainly with our commercial space partners, and really opening it up to the general population. Not everyone's going to be an extreme athlete and perfect in every sense of being able to fly. And what you are able to assess here is how does the general public do? So I think as we begin to do more flights and we really move more into that commercial space realm, we'll have another body of data that we can understand and study.
Now, obviously, this group today and a lot of what we've been talking about, and we've mentioned this a few times, but I want to really make sure people understand the emphasis on this. When you talked about Ebola, when we're talking about COVID, what we do in space is informed by what we learn on the Earth. But what we learn in space, actually, we do bring back to Earth to better understand human health writ large. So I want to make people sure, people know it. NASA spinoffs really do include the issue of what we're learning about the human body in space.
Very, very important. And again, the space program belongs to everyone. Men and women are paying for this program, and they should have direct benefit for it. It's not just reaching for the stars, which is an extraordinary goal and aim, but also how does it improve our lives on Earth? And I believe that's always been part of NASA's mission to ensure that, where there's that sort of tech transfer component. Let's talk about Ebola. I remember working with you over at the White House regarding Ebola, and NASA played a major role in regard to our tech transfer. We had environmental sensing. We looked at PPE in extreme environments. We looked at how do you operate in an environment where you're not able to move directly around interacting with your patients. I mean, there were a lot of exchanges between the space program and public health there, and we see that. So I think this is really exciting for us today, that we can even do more and more of that. Certainly imaging in remote areas is very important. Telemedicine, I often think of the space program as the pioneer of telehealth. Look back to our early days of Mercury and Apollo, and we can see how far we've come.
And one of the other opportunities you had this year was to speak with the National Space Council, and I wonder if you can talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, it was a real honor to be able to do that and to talk a bit about the work that we had pioneered over the years. So I had an opportunity to talk about how the impact of sex and gender impacts our ability to explore. And mentioning again, it's not just for space exploration, it impacts how we live our lives, both in our homes and in our hot zones and our battlefields. I talked about that it's really time not only for the space program, but for every organization to take what I call a human systems integration approach, so that it's time to see the world through a sex gender lens. And it needs to be not just from research, but also from clinical, engineering, outreach, education, human resources, not only for NASA, but for all our commercial partners as well. And I think it's time.
It's really encouraging because, again, to me, this has been an issue that I got really interested in, because when you start understanding that these differences exist, and it is really, I've said this a couple times, it really is about leveling the playing field. It's like, if we want the maximum performance from everyone, and we know diverse teams perform better than non-diverse teams,
right,
but we have to understand what the differences are, and then we have to find ways to mitigate them, and then everybody's on the playing field. And in some cases, women perform better than men, like with the SANS, the eye condition. And in some cases, like with cancer risk, women are in a different position. And so how do we make sure that there's a level playing field so that everyone can participate to their fullest?
Well, and again, that was sort of the driving factor behind the iGiant, to accelerate the translation of research into gender and sex design elements, such as those products, protocols, policies, and programs across every aspect of our lives. And I think as we develop these design elements, we will begin to level the field. I often say that if employers provide the resources and the opportunities and tools, they're more inclined to recruit individuals to come and use them, and individuals are more inclined to want to come and stay. So it's a win-win proposition for everyone, and it also improves the economic calculus of a company. You get the best work from everyone, not just one group.
And when you look out to sort of what would be your ideal world, 10 years from now with humans at the moon, what kind of research would you like to see being conducted at that point?
I would love to see lunar colonies where we actually have a sustained presence, and to see how we handle, as you mentioned, behavioral health and every single other aspect as our body adapts to space. So I think that will be important. And then we're certainly on our way to Mars. It's really the culmination of many years of work. So I think looking at sex gender differences, looking at inclusion and diversity so that we're able to tailor care to the individual will be extremely important. We know there are significant individual differences, but again, as we look at human factors, we're able to assess trends, to do valid analysis, and we can develop the best policies and programs and products for folks.
That's awesome. Well, if we don't have any more questions, I really want to thank you. This has been really fascinating, and I always love talking to you, Saralyn.
It's been a pleasure, a great joy to talk to you, and thank you so much for including us in the conference today.
Thanks. Thanks, everybody, for joining us.
Thank you.